So yes, I'm Vanessa Lee. I'm an Elixir developer at Interfolio. And at Interfolio, we're a higher ed software company. We provide a faculty lifecycle management platform. It sort of helps them with all their paperwork. It's much more involved than I ever knew. But when I'm not developing, one of the things I'm very interested in is true crime. So watch true crime, read, listen. And as a matter of fact, I just completed my first course in forensic genealogy. And some of you may question this interest, and I will address a few justifications for why I'm interested in this. But primarily, I love solving puzzles, and I really like putting right or wrong. Plus, I was raised by my World War II era grandparents who taught me that bearing witness is my responsibility, bearing witness to history, politics, the suffering of others. And I'm also from Texas, so we have a pretty bloody and murderous history, and I don't just mean the Alamo. There is one particular year in Austin's history that if we bear witness to the events of this year, we can become better developers, I think, and in particular, by testing our software. So the year was 1884, and a series of murders began in Austin, Texas. So typically, the first American serial killer is said to be H.H. Holmes. It was the Chicago World's Fair, but it was 1891. And before that, a few years before, 1884, in Austin, in December, a series of murders began. But 1884 in Austin was really exciting. So the Gilded Age had finally caught up to this tiny little cow town. As a matter of fact, 17 businesses had phones. There was money in the coffers to finally build a capital. And the University of Texas opened with one building, 8 professors, and 221 students. But on the night of December 30th, Molly Smith, a 25-year-old black servant woman, was brutally murdered. And over the course of a single year, 6 more females would be killed. The residents of Austin were scared, and the local paper demanded justice, especially after the victims began to include white women. Now, at this time, there was no criminology, no forensics. Fingerprinting wouldn't even be used for another 7 years. And not even the smartest man in town, who was William Sidney Porter, better known by his pen name O. Henry, couldn't solve this mystery. But he did give the murders a name. He called them the Servant Girl Annihilator Murders. He said in a letter to a friend, "This town is fearfully dull, except for the frequent raids of the servant girl annihilators who make things lively during the late night hours." And these crimes remained unsolved, but not for lack of trying. So the mayor at the time, J.W. Robertson, knew he needed help. So he sent a telegram to Chicago, to the Pinkerton Agency. Now, at this time, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency was a big deal. Alan Pinkerton had thwarted an assassination attempt on President-elect Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln then hired Pinkerton agents as his security during the Civil War. But unbeknownst to poor Mayor Robertson, there were 2 Pinkerton agencies in Chicago at the time. There were the real Pinkertons, and then a less renowned Pinkerton and Company, run by Matt Pinkerton, former night watchman at the real Pinkertons, who was fired for incompetence. And unfortunately, Austin's mayor's telegram ended up in the fake Pinkerton office, and the agent showed up in Austin having never investigated a murder. Now, the mayor figured out his mistake pretty quickly, but decided not to tell anyone because it might affect his political career. So eventually it didn't matter because the agents bungled the investigation and everyone found out anyway. But can we blame poor Mayor Robertson? I mean, he didn't know that there were 2 agencies. It was an unknown unknown. And unknown unknowns are the primary reason we test our software. So personally, I have benefited a lot from browser automation testing to help me find my unknown unknowns and to illuminate my blind spots. So I said I would justify my interest in true crime, and one of the ways that I do that is that I believe my interest in true crime comes from a modern form of a concept called sympathetic magic. So a shaman may have painted a successful hunt on a cave wall as a way of magicking that success into the real world. And I worry about murder as a way to not be murdered. So I'm building a fortress of information to protect me and my family. And it's fair to say that Mayor Robertson should have worried a little bit more about murder and less about his political career, but we can learn from his mistake. We can do our best to uncover our unknowns in our software and build a fortress of information through testing. So we have some categories of testing. We have unit checks that check that a specific unit is functioning as it should. Integration tests that look how different pieces, different units integrate together. And acceptance or end-to-end or E2E testing that check to make sure our users can actually use our software. We're going to look specifically at acceptance testing. So the goal of acceptance testing is to mimic as closely as possible the behavior of an actual user. So you could have 100% coverage in your unit tests, which we all do, I'm sure, but you still won't know for certain that your software works for a user. So how do we choose a library for browser automation? There are some questions we ask when we go out and look for a library. And actually, Johanna, who's here, gave me a whole another list of questions that I need to ask when I go look at libraries. But in particular, you want to find out how many people use it, how often is it maintained and updated, is there documentation, does it have its own tests, especially if it's trying to encourage you to test, and look over the issues and the pull requests. So that's what we're going to do. I've got a little Phoenix app that's just going to look at the GitHub API. So we'll take a look at a term like browser tests. And we get back 8 results. And we can see that the top 3 are relatively mature. They've been around for a while. But once we start looking at things like the number of stars, the number of watchers or forks, then we see the top 2 stand out. So Hound and Wallaby, both been around for a while, have a lot of people who are interested in them, people who have forked them, and also a lot of open issues, which means there are people actively using the software, reporting issues. And then we can take a look. We'll dive down a little deeper into each of these and take a look at whether they meet the other criteria we were told to look for. We've got documentation for Hound. And then we can take a look at issues. Let's see what sort of issues they've got. And I won't drag you down the hole I went down. But when I went and looked at these issues, it looks like, I mean, these maintainers are doing us a favor, right? They're doing this for us for free. And sometimes I think they forget to close issues. There's a lot of issues, but really old and probably not relevant anymore. And we'll see the same is true for Wallaby. There's fantastic documentation. You have to go down a little further here, but I do like that they have a logo. And yeah, so we've got the official documentation is fantastic, and a similar set of issues of people actively using and finding things that can improve about the software. So we've justified, I believe, that these 2 libraries are worth looking at. So let's take a look at them. Let's compare them. We'll look at some similarities and differences, pros and cons. We'll run a few benchmarks, and then we'll even talk about some non-Elixir alternatives. So, Hound was created about 6 years ago on my birthday, December 15th, in 2013. And Wallaby, just about 3 years later, in April, as a response to Ecto 2.0. And when you boil it down, for me, the biggest difference between the 2 came down to Hound is really explicit, and Wallaby is very implicit, relative. So they both integrate with XUnit, so you can have them right alongside that 100% unit coverage that you have, and then all of your browser automation tests will cover everything else. And in particular, Hound requires a lot of explicit syntax where you're telling helpers exactly what you want to find in the DOM. So you have to know, are you looking for an ID? Or are you looking to match on a name? Or you can use XPath. Whereas Wallaby does some of that work for you. It's sort of in the vein of Capybara, and the XPath work is done behind the scenes. So you give the CSS term you want to be found, and Wallaby will find it for you by going through the different options that are available. Hound also requires the explicit assignment of a WebDriver, and then you also have to start that WebDriver on your own. Whereas Wallaby didn't used to demand the explicit assignment of a WebDriver, but since I think we can all agree Phantom.js is dead, and shout hallelujah, but then we now have, the maintainers have done a great job offering experimental support for Selenium and Chrome driver. So you can now, in Wallaby specifically, assign one of those WebDrivers, but it will still start it for you. Both can be run headless or non-headless, and since you're already explicitly starting that WebDriver in Hound, you can change at that point. So each of your tests can run differently, headless or non-headless. Wallaby, you have to put it in the config, and it applies to all tests. You're able to interact with hidden elements in Hound, visible elements with Wallaby, but Wallaby does allow you to change the visibility of an element if you really need to interact with it. And they both work well for JavaScript-heavy apps. They both run asynchronously, concurrently. With Hound, you do explicitly have to start multiple sessions to get that concurrency. And both will take screenshots for you. I really like Wallaby has the option where you can take it upon all failures and put it in a very specific place so you know when things are going wrong. And then if we're talking specifically about pros, and these often can be a matter of taste, but with Wallaby, I'm really grateful to the maintainers being so responsive, and I think they're going to lose that adjective of experimental pretty soon because I've been using it, and it's fantastic. In particular, there's one helper. Wallaby has query select helper, so you can grab an option from a select list, and this doesn't sound like much, but I started with Hound and then went to Wallaby, and Hound, does not have that. You have to use some JavaScript to select an option from a select list. But we're going to see some costs in the benchmarking that are interesting later. Wallaby is extremely pipeable. It's pretty. It's easy to look at, easy to read, easy to figure out what's going on at each step. There's also a data helper. So if you do not have access to the ID or the name or any control over the front end, you can have something that's less brittle, like a data attribute somewhere to grab onto. And most of the operations block until the query is valid, but we'll see on the con list that there's some side effects with that. Some pros for Hound. It supports Selenium and Chrome driver. I really like the search element. The search element helper will not raise an error. If it can't find the element, it will send a tuple that you could catch. The implicit syntax worked really well for me. That was an intuitive kind of syntax for me personally, but then again, I didn't come from Ruby. It's highly configurable, Hound is. Specifically the retry times, you can get that to work for whatever you need. And cons, so as I mentioned, that retry helper can sometimes never halt. So it's incredibly determined to get it to work, and sometimes it can loop forever until X unit kills it. Some folks on Stack Overflow have reported some problems with Wallaby in live view. I've not given it a try yet, so I'm not sure, but there were a few people talking about it. And again, the syntax wasn't quite as intuitive to me, but it's growing on me. And then Hound, though, if you don't, so I was using Hound originally to work with a front end written in Ember.js where I had no access over my IDs. My IDs were always hijacked by Ember, and I had to write so much regex, and I hated it. Having to use such explicit regex was tiresome and brittle. You have to use, this is what I mentioned before, to get a select option list, they have a helper, execute JavaScript, that you have to use. It's just not as intuitive. You're using all your helpers, it's going along smoothly, and then it's something completely different to get a select option. And some folks on Stack Overflow tend to have problems with running the tests asynchronously. I haven't had any problems, but some folks have. So let's see them in action. We're going to interact with a simple credit card form and run a few tests against it. So the most simple kind of test that we could look at is something that just navigates to a page and makes sure the page has the correct title. And here it's 3 lines each. It's pretty simple. The syntax is pretty easy to understand. You can get a little more fancy by actually interacting with the form, finding the input elements, putting some values in there. And here you see the execute script here, whereas I could have my nice little select helper down here. And again, very pipeable and easy to read with Wallaby. That is nice. And here we're submitting the form, and I'm putting in all valid form data, so I expect a success message to appear. And I thought I could run those for you really quickly. And I will say that you need to not blink because they're really fast. I slowed down so the first one especially, whoops. No, you get a sneak peek at what's coming next. There we go. So it will just be a flash before your eyes, but a nice green message. And then if we look at what I've done is looped through the form a couple times, so it will actually slow it down a bit so you can see some of the entries being made and maybe even a success message. There we go. So pretty standard. And then when we move on to benchmark some of the differences, we can use a library like Benchy. That's phenomenal. And what Benchy gives us is before and after scenarios that I can start the sessions and not have to worry about them in each individual test. And this test is doing a very similar thing to the one previous. It's going to fill out that form with valid data, but then change one particular field to a stream data amount. So it's randomly generated. It could be a success or failure, which I know based on business logic should produce either a success or a failure alert. And so when I run those, this is on a small data set, but I'm showing it anyway because this trend is going to continue even as the sample sets get larger. What you see overall is that Hound is a little faster, Wallaby is a little slower. And Wallaby takes up a lot more memory, but that's probably because it's doing a lot of the work for me. So a lot of the work that didn't have to go into writing out some explicit syntax is being done behind the scenes. And when we start looking at something bigger, so here I wanted to see if there was any difference between different data types. So we've got integers, floats, negative integers, strings, large integers, and what I see is the same trend. Hound is a little bit faster across the board, no matter what the data type is. Wallaby is a little slower. The box plots are interesting just because Hound really seems to have some deviation with strings. But I was using stream data that was using the big list of naughty strings, so I was really throwing some potentially tiresome values at both of them. And then the memory usage you can see really well here, that trend, no matter what the data type is. And then I wanted to look at the different helpers. So these, what I chose for helpers to benchmark were just the helpers that they introduced themselves in their READMEs. So what they expect people to be using right off the bat. So we've got navigation, finding an element, checking to see if something is visible. And then I snuck in there the select, the 2 different ways of getting a select action to see if I could see anything unique there. And what I found is the execute JavaScript is a little faster, quite a bit faster than the helper, but that's, I think, again, because Wallaby is doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes. That's a little trigger happy. Let me back up one. So I wanted to take a look at, because another way that people will use these libraries in addition to getting browser automation testing is web scrapers. So I thought I would take a look at a benchmark for an external website. So this is just a really simple test of navigate to Google, enter a search term browser tests, check that there are results and that those results number something greater than 1, and that they include the word browser. So I think this is where we're going to see, you'll see in the benchmark, things even out a little bit, because I think this plays to Wallaby's strengths. Wallaby is really good at finding repetitive DOM elements, and like search results or API results, and it's in particular built-in counters. So it's going to, it's made to do this kind of testing. So, and really, Hound does not shine here in terms of how its readability. So the data that we find here in the benchmarking is interesting. So these it's the same test just with larger sample sizes, and they really do even out. We get similar iterations per second, both in Wallaby and Hound. So it's nice, it gives Wallaby a chance to shine too. And I thought, just in case you guys don't believe me, let's run it so you can see. Oh, and you can't see the fun part, because one of the fun parts is in the nav bar. You'll see all the little chromes open as you're running them concurrently. And I think there really are a large subset of people who are using these as web scrapers, not as testers. And then we can see here how Benchy breaks down the results for us, so you can get all your system information, and then you can look at them individually or as the comparison. And yeah, we got the same trend where they both get about the same iterations per second. I used Wallaby as a scraper to help with looking at, there's a database in the United States for missing children. And so you can help, you can scrape that data and help manipulate it and look at it in different ways. So I've given a lot of information, right, that may help you choose a library that would work for you, whether it's about how faster Hound can be or the syntax of Wallaby, or I may have turned you off from ever using a library for browser automation testing. And if that's the case, then you've got some other options. You could pay a service. There's options for that. You could use Selenium itself. You could use another framework, Robot Framework, Cucumber, Cypress. Or if you've got money and resources and lots of time, you could do a Selenium grid, which would be awesome to see, or maybe Selenium and Docker. And just to revisit, the Selenium grid as an idea is so phenomenal, where you could have all of these nodes running different operating systems with different browser versions, every type of IE ever, and you could just watch everything fail and report it. But from what I've heard from people actually doing this, it's quite costly, and the maintenance is a nightmare. But Selenium does provide a lot of Docker containers. So for different browser versions, you could maybe build a Dockerized grid. But I want to talk about one framework that I found that, although it does not integrate with XUnit, it does integrate really well with an Elixir project. And that is Cypress. So it's really easy to install and run right inside any Elixir app or Phoenix app that you're doing. And it has a dashboard that it's going to show you in just a second, and then it will allow you to run all these sample tests that it comes with, and it gives you a nice little display as it's running of how you're succeeding or not. And what was nice about it, too, was that it's written in JavaScript. So if your team is made up of people with multiple skills, so I've worked in both environments where I've had no QA and where I was responsible for my own QA, and with a QA team. And whatever solution is going to work to get you there, whether maybe you have a teammate who could write this in JavaScript, or whether you have to do it within your knowledge base. There's lots of options. So what this will do, so we'll run it against our little credit card app. And you can, so this is open, Cypress open, and that's going to open that little dashboard. You can just run them as if it were headless too. And what's nice about the little dashboard, which I think is going to appear on my display, not on yours. Let's see. There we go. You can change whatever browsers you have locally. You can change what browser you want to use. You can run the tests independently. You can record them. I don't have any recorded, but you can record some to show people. You can run them all. And they're running back here. So it's going to run through all of them and give me the printout of all the results as well. And just, can we get back here? Just there's some of the syntax too. And especially after working with Wallaby and Hound, it was incredibly easy to pick up. It's just really simple JavaScript. So there are so many options. There's really no excuse not to do your browser automation testing, but when someone tells me what to do, I don't like to do it. So maybe you're thinking never in a million years, and maybe you want to have your own version of sympathetic magic, so you could make a voodoo doll of your deployment manager or your QA manager and see how that works for you. But hopefully you have found something that you could take home. And when we do find something in the community that works for us, it's nice to give back in a certain way. So I wanted to go over some of the ways that we can contribute back to the Elixir community. And easy, we can do some pull requests. When you find an issue with a library, report it, try to fix it, put something out there for the rest of us. Or you could be inspired to build something new, and it wasn't really in the scope of this talk, but there's some great libraries out there for story BDD testing, Cabbage and Whitebread. And also in the README of your open source projects, maybe just a small paragraph, why you chose the dependencies you did, what went into it, share some of the footwork you did with the people out in the community so they don't have to spin their wheels on the same thing. You could also make sure that your open source projects are findable. Are you using the right tags in GitHub? Are you making it something other people can find? And speaking of, somebody on our Hoover app this morning announced that they have a testing software or testing library that they wanted to share that tests GraphQL queries against an absent schema and requires no HTTP requests. So I just stuck this in here because I thought that was really awesome. And they're right here today. I'm not sure who they are, but they're here today. And I wanted to share this post from Chris Keithley, who is the creator of Wallaby. The year that he created Wallaby, just a few months before it launched, he had a few resolutions that I think we could also borrow from. And he says he's only going to make positive comparisons between tools. For example, X has this cool thing, which we should do in Y. And secondary, he's going to speak critically only of things he's excited and invested in. And lastly, contribute more. Which leads to something interesting. When he was ready to step aside from Wallaby and move on to something else, he asked if there would be some people to take over the library for him. And 2 people did step up and do that. And unfortunately, before they did, a lot of people saw this post and thought Wallaby was dead and dying and chose not to use it, which is unfortunate, but I think that's why he's kept this up there that says, no, hey, not only is it still alive, it's being maintained by the community. So I think this can be really inspirational. Some people really stepped up, and they're doing a great job. So I believe that we have to worry. I believe we have to plan for the worst. And Chris Keithley said in his Gig City Elixir talk last year, failure is always an option. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, because no one expects the servant girl annihilator, right? And especially not the poor folks in Austin in 1884 who didn't even know what a serial killer was. I mean, the term didn't even exist. And we heard, like, O. Henry used the plural. They figured somebody different was doing each of these all the times that the murders occurred. And we definitely don't want to follow in the lead of Austin's mayor, right? If you ignore the problem, it's not going to go away. It's not going to be solved, and you're not going to prevent it from happening again. And so when we fail, there's an opportunity to learn. There's an opportunity to illuminate dark spaces. And speaking of illuminating dark spaces, if you want to find me later, I'll tell you about the illumination that came to save the residents of Austin 10 years after the murders and became an icon of the city. It's Party at the Moon Tower, anyone? So go home and write your integration tests with a library or test runner that you love. Until then, be safe out there, and thank you. Appreciate it.
I have a question. Have you tried the purpose beta test maybe to apply and generate the test for those cases?
Say again. I didn't
The
hear.
purpose beta test.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, I haven't. I read the book.
Oh.
Well, I say I've read the book. I've read parts of it once, but they're going to take a second reading in order to get it all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, but I've used some of the concepts, right? Like, so even the one that I used with benchmarking, I'm using the idea of fuzzing and using stream data to fuzz, but not really. Property-based testing is a tough one. Breaking your apps down into their properties is a good exercise and one that I haven't mastered, even close.
Great, great. We have some more questions. No one? So thank you, Vanessa.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.